Hello and welcome to the Rejuvenated Woman podcast. I would certainly say my guest today is a rejuvenated and well-embodied woman and simply a divine human being who I adore. Let me introduce you to Helen Padarin. Helen is a clinical naturopath, nutritionist, herbalist, public speaker, lecturer, retreat facilitator and author. She has been in clinical practice for 19 years. She is a best-selling co-author of the books The Complete Gut Health Cookbook and Bubba Yum Yum, Foods to Thrive for New Parents, Babies and Toddlers. Helen has contributed chapters to the peer-reviewed textbooks Clinical Naturopathic Medicine and Advanced Clinical Naturopathic Medicine by Leah Hechtman. Working from the foundation of food as medicine, Helen loves to work with individuals and communities to empower them to find the joy in being well. Working with hundreds of children with ASD, autism early in her career has taught Helen invaluable lessons in healing for the rest of the population, chronic, multi-system, inflammatory conditions. These children have been massive guiding lights for many. Helen is also an ambassador for the Mind Foundation and Inner Origin. Her clinical areas of interest are gut health, SIBO, inflammatory bowel disease, IBS, autoimmune disease, including but not limited to Hashimoto's thyroiditis, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, allergies, ADHD, chronic fatigue syndrome, anxiety and depression, and the journey of Know Thyself. Wow. So now you know why I'm so excited to have Helen on this show. Welcome, gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. I almost burst into tears then, just the way that you introduced me. And, I really felt that in my heart, the love from you then. So thank you.
You're so welcome.
I love you.
I love you too. So we won't just have this love thing. Today's topic, the reason why I brought this incredible woman on the show today, we're not going to talk about the food or anything because you can search Helen on many platforms and you'll be able to hear about her talking about food and how she contributes to the health of the collective. Today, I wanted to bring Helen on to speak about trauma, such a valid topic, I think, for every single one of us, because I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, we all have our share of trauma. So, the trauma can actually hinder our physical, emotional, mental and spiritual health. So, darling, what guided you to navigate the path of studying and working with patients dealing with trauma?
Yeah, well, first of all, totally agree. I think, part of the experience of being human is to experience trauma. I mean, birth in itself is a traumatic event, and we're stronger for it. But there are, traumas that can occur throughout our life, whether it is unresolved birth trauma or whether it is things that have happened later on that really impact how we function as humans, basically, physically, mentally and emotionally. So the way I came about it was really through my own journey. So I guess, I've been in clinical practice now for 21 years, which is crazy. It doesn't feel like, I'm old enough to say that, but apparently I am. And I guess, for the last roughly 21 years, I've been on a big journey of heal myself. And especially for around the last 18 years where I've done a lot of my own therapy, counselling, trauma, healing along the way, that has really opened up my eyes and my heart and just my experience to all the different flavours of life that there is for us to engage with, yeah. And so it's one of those things, many years ago I probably would have said, I haven't experienced any trauma, I've had a really happy, life and very fortunate family and all of those kinds of things. But we only ever know what's normal for us, right? And what we have experienced becomes our template for how we see the rest of the world. And these days, you know, unless there is some profound shock trauma, so shock trauma is something that is very obvious kind of trauma. It can be assault, it can be rape, it can be violence, crime, it can be natural disasters even, you know, it could be a car accident, it can be any of these kinds of things. So we tend to really understand those things as trauma. But one thing that we don't tend to understand so much within our own experience is developmental trauma or emotional trauma. And this is the kind of trauma that is like a million micro arrows over time, and it happens subtly. And so we don't actually realize the impact on how it affects our nervous system and therefore how we express ourselves in the world. So that can often be, not necessarily the harder trauma to work with, but it can be the more confusing one, because there's often still love involved with it or good intentions involved with it, however, wasn't necessarily healthy, you know. So that's where it can get really confusing. And I guess, so a combination of doing my own work over the years with a therapist who I still see regularly now, she's like my spiritual mama, and then through my clinical, yes, that's right, so Karima, who wrote that book, Becoming Whole, which is a manual for being human, basically. It's one of those books that you will go back to and refer to over and over, like, I'm feeling guilty at the moment, or I'm feeling angry at the moment, or I feel shame at the moment, or I feel joy at the moment, or, you know, and you can go to the part in that book to kind of understand that more, and also bring a lot more compassion and kindness to ourselves and allow things to transform and transmute rather than to hold on to them with, you know, shame or anything like that. But yeah, through my clinical practice and working with a lot of really chronically ill patients, one thing I really noticed over the last couple of decades is the more severely ill someone is, or the more chronically ill someone is, the less of an idea they have of what gives them joy, which is really a symptom of being disconnected from yourself, disconnected from one another, and disconnected from nature. And so a big part of the way that I work with people is to really focus on those joys and reconnecting with the self, because it's usually those parts of us that are in our shadows, what we call our shadow work, that can often come laden with a sense of shame and heaviness and wanting to hide. If we can step into those places with some compassion, you know, the heart is so important in all of this work, then we can actually get much more connected with ourselves, and then our actions and our life will be much more aligned with who we are rather than living someone else's life because of conditioning and societal shoulds and family upbringing and schooling and all of those kinds of things that put all of these layers upon layers upon layers of our essential selves.
Mm-hmm. So multi-level, I guess, degrees of trauma.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily an event, but it could be a thought or correct me if I'm wrong, a behaviour that we've adapted from perhaps a trauma, like someone telling us something. Would that have
absolutely
an effect?
Yeah, so a lot of developmental trauma, for example, predominantly occurs in the first few years of life, because as humans, we are very dependent on our caregivers, you know. Other animals in nature are, you know, walking within hours of their birth and finding food and all of those kinds of things. But for us, we are very dependent on our caregivers for several years before we're able to be independent, right? And so as a result, we tend to shape our behaviours in a way that we believe will keep our caregivers looking after us. Yeah.
Okay.
So we will have these protective behaviours of, if there is a perceived threat to our safety or security, to our need to be loved, to be fed, to be sheltered, if there's a perceived threat to those things, we'll adapt our behaviour, maybe shut down parts of ourselves because it wasn't okay to be a certain way, like, you know, don't scream in front of me, or don't be angry because I don't like the way that makes me feel, you know. So you learn to shut down those parts of yourself and not actually express yourself, because if you do, you're going to be responsible for how that other person feels. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that now. Like, how many people do you speak to who go, I look after other people's needs before I look after my own. I sabotage myself to make sure someone else is okay.
Probably,
and in doing so, I make myself sick. Sometimes I even kill myself to put others before me, you know. And this is one thing that can really make us sick. So yes, we want to be able to look after and take care of other people, but we also need to take care of ourselves, because if we don't take care of ourselves as adults, we can't really take care of others to a effective degree either. Okay, so a lot of the healing of our developmental trauma from childhood, you know, well, first of all, it's important to say that a lot of the time our parents, you know, are doing everything with the utmost love and good intention, right? The last thing almost any parent wants to do is inflict trauma on their child. Yeah. So a lot of this trauma actually is unintentional and comes from a space of love. So it's not to play a blame game here. It's just that's what it is, because they were wounded as well, right? So we've got wounded people unintentionally wounding people. And when we become aware of that wounding, it becomes our responsibility to then reparent ourselves and heal those wounds. Yeah. And when we do that, it affects not only us, but it affects those around us, whether it's in our communities, our families, and our greater collective as well. Like, one of the things Thomas Hubel talks about, he's a guy whose jam is collective trauma. Really worth looking up. So he's a German guy who has lived, you know, part in Germany, part in Israel, so places where there's a lot of collective trauma. And the thing that he keeps coming back to is the way to heal collective trauma is for us each to heal individually, because that changes the way that we are in the world. It changes our interactions with other people in our world. It essentially might sound a bit woo-woo, but it's actually how it is. It changes their field, it changes their energy around. And the more people who do that, the greater that bubble, that field grows, you know. And it influences, everybody knows, if you feel bad juju, bad vibes, you feel it. If you feel good vibes, you feel it, you know. It's something that permeates you and it affects you. So the more that we can all do our own healing, the more that permeates those who are around us, and the more that then spreads. So I think part of, you know, it's a really appropriate thing at the moment, or an apt thing at the moment in the world, with the degree of collective trauma that's going on, and all this stuff for the greater good, and don't be selfish, and don't do, you know, there's too much thinking about me and not about we. But it's not as simple as that. Because to think about we have to think about me.
Before we.
Each me is part of the we. Yeah. Each me is part of the we, you know. So you can't just think about the we without the me. And as, you know, one of our friends and mentors, Paul Check, would say, you know, when you're creating your vision and your purpose and your dream in the world, you need to come first, you know. And that took me a bit of coaching, because I would always, as well put other people first. I'm like, I want to, facilitate transformation in others and myself. And he's like, what's wrong with that statement? And I'm like, I don't know, it seems pretty great to me. And he's like, look at it, keep looking at it, read it. And what he was getting at was I needed to put me before everyone else. So I facilitate transformation within myself and the others rather than others and myself. If we all do that, we're all living and acting from a much more resourced, powerful place than putting ourselves last.
100%. I love that. And it's something, we're always encouraging our clients. And you probably agree that it's the women usually are the ones that are outsourcing and putting themselves last and caring for everyone else. And I appreciate, I feel you're the earth mother, and we do need to heal this wound, because trauma is the wound, right? Yeah, is that what you would define trauma as, a wound? You mentioned also about, that disassociation, the learned pattern. When we disassociate ourselves or we kind of shut ourselves down, it's a protecting mechanism, yes? So if birth is a traumatic experience, I know that mine was, and I know, when I had my son Ryan, he was born premature, so that he was in a stress response. So how would someone go about healing from that phase? I mean, you've done decades of work, you mentioned, and it is very deep work. Where would someone start with that? How would they identify that it has come from there, or do they really need to see you, a specialist, to help them unpack that, besides looking into this beautiful book?
I think, the path is different for everybody. There's a lot of really powerful modalities. So one that I am 2/3 of the way through studying, and something I practice myself, is somatic experiencing, which we can go into a little bit in a moment, but there can be other ways to go about it as well. I mean, when it comes to birth trauma, there are people who specifically specialize in that area. There are some doulas who do that kind of work, like post-birth integration of the experience that happens. There are, ceremonies that you can do after birth. There's like a ceremony called the closing of the bones, for example, which some doulas will help facilitate, which can really help to round out that experience of what the birth was, and the mother coming back to themselves after being so open in the process of giving birth. Good doulas as well, really, if you're going into a second birth, will always want to make sure anything from the first birth that has not yet been processed has been processed, has the opportunity to be processed and healed, so that that's not then taken into the second birth. The fears and the anxieties of whatever may have happened before do not need to have any bearing on what can happen in future when that is healed. So there's all sorts of people who do that kind of healing work. A dear friend of ours, Heidi East, does some of that work with women, which is really powerful. And she knows a collective of other women who do similar kind of work too. So I'm probably not the best person to speak about our birth culture, but there's a fantastic movie called Birth Story, which I highly recommend everybody have a watch of, man, woman and child, because we all came into the world that way. And we are also, I think, one thing that we need to bear in mind that does create a lot of birth trauma these days is the kind of patriarchal medical system and the medicalization of birth as well. So both of those things can actually increase the layers of trauma that a woman might experience as she's giving birth. So having real matriarchal guidance through that experience can be super empowering and result in a very different birth experience, or can result in healing of traumas that occurred as a result of the current mainstream system. Yeah.
Wow, so powerful, really powerful work.
I have so much respect for that work. Yeah.
Because when you talk about, in the birthing process, I think with that medical model, and sometimes, we need it, but just by, because I think when everyone plans to have a child, we have a kind of an idea of how we want it to be. But even just the thought of things not going to plan, and most of the time they don't, but it's just having that idea, and then I guess the interventions that the medical model can have, they kind of prevent the natural process of it happening, right? Which is a trauma in itself.
Yeah, it can do. And, our bodies are incredible. Our bodies are so wise. They hold so much information, so much intelligence that we're not even aware of in our minds, and sometimes it is a matter of trusting that as well. It's not to say there's never a place for medical intervention. Of course, there is a place for it, but it needs to be used judiciously rather than as a course of action, all the time. But in regards to other types of avenues or where to start with people, I mean, even things like dance or acting or yoga or any of these kinds of things can actually be really powerful tools for healing trauma, because they're all things that help us get back into our body, right? And one of the things that trauma does is takes us out of our body. It's that dissociation, and we're just in our head, and our head is making meaning of what we're feeling, even though it isn't necessarily correct at the time. Because what will happen as well from developmental trauma is we'll be, as an adult, in a situation that might reflect in some way similar dynamics to how things were when that trauma was created as a child. And so then, even though we are safe and secure now, we'll react or play that old record of, when I was in this kind of dynamic before, this is how I respond, and this is my protective mechanism. And that might actually now sabotage us, whereas before it protected us. So one thing we want to really be mindful of as well is that we approach these parts of ourselves with a lot of compassion, big open-hearted compassion, because it can be super easy, I'll speak from my own experience, to get like really critical or judgy or frustrated or whatever, shameful about having a certain behavior or feeling a certain trauma. But the truth of the matter is that was there to protect us, and it was really valuable. At one point in time, it's what kept us safe. Sometimes it's what kept us alive, So we want to be really grateful for that and approach it with compassion, because when we approach something with compassion, you can maybe even feel it a little bit in your body now. If you approach a part of yourself that you feel a bit tense or tight or critical about, imagine approaching that part with compassion rather than just with harsh judgment. And what you'll likely notice is that that part softens a little bit. Yeah. Whereas if we approach it with this hard criticism, it's going to tense up and walls are going to go up and it's going to hold on tighter. So it's that open-heartedness that helps it to transmute. So bringing that into awareness is really important, and then things that bring us into our body is really important, and being able to feel things, because part of dissociation is that is too uncomfortable or terrifying or devastating to feel. I'm out of here. Yeah. And so that's when you're like, I'm fine. I'm fine. It's like, no, you're not. Get in there and feel what's going on there.
Yeah.
because your body is this incredible antenna or barometer. If we connect with it, it gives us so much feedback, and it really provides the invitation of where we need to go for the healing as well, you know. And you can do it on your own with like body scans and just kind of going through your body head to toe, and just sensing what you feel, where feels tight, where feels loose, where feels uncomfortable, where feels hard to go to, where feels dead, where feels soft. Like, you can just go through and kind of map out your body, and if there's any parts that don't feel nice in one way or another, that's where you can, if it feels comfortable or even a little bit uncomfortable, just to tiptoe up to it with a bit of compassion and just kind of be a little bit curious about it with compassion, rather than, oh, it's tight there. Why is it tight there? I've been doing all this work and it's still tight and I want to...
Right.
It's like, oh, you're tight there. I wonder what that's about. It's okay. You can be tight. If you want to be tight, you can be tight.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And just allowing it to be what it is will help it soften, you know. I do...
I just like getting the feels. It's kind of like stroking your hand here, right, to give some self-love and compassion.
Yeah, and sometimes... Yeah, and actually self-touch is a really beautiful way to help to get yourself back in your body. Like, people might want to experiment that with that a little bit now, you know. We can, whether you're sitting or standing, one tool that you can use to just bring yourself back to the present and back in your body, especially if you're feeling stressed or anxious or your mind is racing or anything like that, is first either on your arm or your leg, just kind of feel the surface of your body, see where your body ends, where the barriers of your body is, feel your skin. And then a little bit deeper, you just feel what's under your skin, or how your skin slides, how your fascia slides. And then you can really feel your bone, like feel where your bones are. And you'll often find, just by doing that little practice, which you can do in a minute or 3, you'll notice your heart rate slows down, you feel calmer. Did you notice that yourself just now?
Totally, because I was not thinking of anything else but just feeling. It's that connection of the somatic, or the psyche and the soma, so the mind and the body, right?
Yeah. And that's what somatic experiencing is, right? So somatic, to feel. We want to get back into the feeling body, because, and this is one of the reasons why it's so effective as a trauma therapy, is because a lot of the time, if we've got, you know, psychological trauma, for example, that's resulted from either something emotional, psychological, physical, sexual, whatever it might have been. As a result, we get psychological trauma anyway, right? And we have stories and beliefs that arise because of that. We can go to counselling, and we can go to psychotherapists, and we can go to psychiatrists, and we can talk about it until the cows come home. And sometimes talking about it can give really valuable insights and understanding about why we react in a certain way when we're in a certain situation. But it usually does very little to actually change those behaviours when we're in that situation and we get triggered, and then we just find ourselves reacting in that way again. So that's called a top-down approach to therapy, where you're working with the mind to understand and get insight and try and, you know, work logically to change a habit or behaviour. But humans are not very logical creatures at the essence of things. We're emotionally driven, right?
I had to laugh. It's just relevant.
Sorry, what was that?
Just that comment was quite relevant now. in these times. Continue. Sorry, darling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, that's all right. And so what somatic therapy is, or somatic experiencing is what is called a bottom-up approach. So rather than working with your mind to try and change your reactions and behaviors, you're working with your body and your nervous system to change your mind, essentially, right? Because what trauma is first and foremost a physiological response, not an emotional response, not a psychological response. First and foremost, it's a physiological response in response to a stress. So our nervous system registers at first, it's not safe, right? And typically speaking, trauma persists in the mind because we were in a position when we experienced it where there wasn't the safety or the time or the empathic other to finish that process with. And so it is stored in our nervous system. And that's where the record keeps playing from, is that pent up tension in the nervous system. And so that's where somatic experiencing comes in, because sometimes the body remembers what the mind doesn't. And it blows my mind every time I witness this in myself or others. It's phenomenal. It's described in great detail in books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate. And when we work with the sensation and the impulse to move in certain ways, for example, or to make certain sounds or whatever it might be, if we allow that impulse, what would happen next? And just allowing that thing to happen next. And then it's amazing the discharge that happens from the nervous system. And you'll see as these processes unfold, and there's many layers of them, but every time there's a discharge, there'll either be some yawning or some tears or a change in the breath and a drop in the shoulders or a flush of heat through the body or something like that. So, and then this greater sense of peace afterwards. And there's many, many layers of that you can go through within even a single session, you know. So that is, it's rewiring or not even rewiring, it's just discharging that tension so that then in future when you find yourself in that similar situation where you'd normally react, you're like, oh, I felt a little bit of a activation there, but it's actually not bothering me so much this time. Or I still reacted, but I noticed it sooner this time, whereas before I might not have realized I did that until a day or two or a week later. It's like, oh, I did that thing. Okay. Compassion with self. That's interesting. And then each time you either notice a bit sooner or get triggered a bit less, or it just doesn't bother you anymore. Or you can just see it for what it is rather than it activating your nervous system again.
So fascinating. So it's really, as that saying says, our issues are stored in our tissues. It's held in the connective tissue, which is, you know, the hierarchy really of our system. I wanted to share. Right. I find it incredibly fascinating that you can release. I'll share a little story. I got knocked down. I was waiting for a bus, and I was on the footpath when I stepped out on the footpath to catch the bus, and I was knocked for 6 by a mountain bike rider on the footpath. And it shook, physically, obviously, you know, I was damaged. But I remember 2 or 3 weeks after, and a friend of mine who does psychosomatic counselling, she said, "How are you?" And I said, "I feel fine on the outside, but I'm still rattled. I feel rattled on the inside." And I think that's just so relevant of what you just shared there, because, you know, yeah, I felt okay on the outside, but there was just still something there. And I had a session with her, and it was so interesting. She was getting me to move in a way that I would have responded if I had have seen the person coming to hit me. So my body, I'm getting tingles again. So listeners, every time I get tingles, it's just, you know, I'm on the right thing, and it's, you know, it's kind of that right path. You know, you're in the right place at the right time. Yeah, so I found that really, really fascinating. And after I did that work, it was okay. However, if someone comes up behind me on a bike, I will notice, but I don't have that, oh my gosh, that response. It's kind of, I was thinking, because I did get pulled over by the cops the other day, it's that if you see a flashing light behind you, it's like, oh my God, what have I done? Yeah, it's kind of a traumatic experience. Right. So, I just felt compelled to share that just with that somatic therapy and shifting it out of the body with a therapist or with some of the tools that you've just said. I love that kind of just closing your eyes and touching and feeling and really connecting to self again. Mm-hmm. What are the...
So that's before you go on. Yeah, the touching and the self-touch is a great way to ground and center, and what you shared is a perfect example of that impulse to move where you didn't have the opportunity to, that impulse to protect yourself where you didn't have the opportunity to, and then to often by really, really slowing that movement down so that you're nervous, if you were pushing something away or something like that, it might look like this.
It was like that, so slow.
And then it's amazing once that comes to a point of completion, you would have noticed afterwards you felt like either a temperature change in your body or tears come or a sigh or something, some kind of let go. Yeah,
it actually amalgamated the two sides of my body because it felt set because I was hit from one side, so I felt together. I've felt more intact. Yeah, more intact and complete.
Yeah, perfect example.
I love Gabor Mate. Gabor, Australian would probably say Gabor mate. But he's French, isn't he? I absolutely love his work.
Polish Canadian.
He sounds, he's French Canadian. That's probably why. I lived in Canada, the French Canadians. But anyway, he talks about as you have discussed today, about that birth and having that, the psychological, it affects the development. And, when we're having that stress response in utero, it can have that responsivity up to the age of 45 and onwards, right? So we talked about the birth process. What about when a woman comes into perimenopause and menopause and she's got all of these things happening in the womb and the utero? Some of them are getting hysterectomies. Can you share where that may have stemmed from? I know we know lifestyle factors that can play a part of these symptoms and things, and some surgeries we have to go through as we get older. But does it come from more of a traumatic response from earlier on, in your opinion? What can you share?
Like having menstrual or womb issues, is that? Where does that come from?
Yes, because I did hear him say, there's something, for example, around the ovaries, if there was, say you had cysts on the ovaries, it could have been a psychological trauma that has impacted that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That goes for any part of the body at any point in time. Like you often talk about as well with autoimmune disease, there's often a suppression of anger and a lack of boundaries, right? Because your immune system is your physical boundary representative of your emotional boundaries. So if your emotional boundaries are leaky, letting in things that shouldn't come in, that kind of thing, start attacking ourselves because we're not, we're putting others first, then that can manifest in autoimmune conditions, right? And particularly with things like thyroid, there's usually a lot of boundaries issues, and a lot of the throat is about expression as well. So it's like, what aren't you expressing? What needs to be expressed, and where do you need to have stronger boundaries in place? Two big questions for anybody who's got Hashimoto's thyroiditis, for example. Yeah. with menstrual issues throughout the years, like there can be a range of different things. I find that there's often a lot of shame around things like endometriosis, not around the condition, although there can be shame around the condition itself, but shame can be one of those things that seeds the condition, where we feel shame about ourselves, about being a woman, about our sexuality, about our sensuality. Like we're in this incredibly, again, patriarchal society these days, these last few thousand years, you know, and it's something I never really gave much heed to in the past myself, because really I grew up a tomboy, and so I thought I felt empowered because I was a strong girl and all of those kinds of things, but I didn't realize until, you know, relatively recent years, and it keeps deepening more and more in the last few years, and I'm sure it will continue to, just how much of my feminine power I put aside to take on the masculine power, yeah? But that doesn't sit so comfortably in my system. You know, it does fatigue me. It does create inflammation. It does, in the past, I had really like excruciatingly painful to the point of vomiting period pain in my teens and early 20s, you know, and PCOS, and probably wouldn't surprise me if I did have some endometriosis back in the day. You know, I did carry a lot of shame around bleeding and being a woman, you know, whereas these days, yeah, I celebrate that a lot more. And I think one thing as women, and young girls, if we can have, you know, initiation and ritual and ceremony and appreciation and reverence for our cycles and the power of our cycles. If I heard myself saying this 15 years ago, I'd be like, what is she talking about? You know, this rubbish. And now I'm like, holy shit, it's really powerful, you know, like women are so powerful. And a lot of our power comes from our womb. And so for women, reconnecting with your womb, super powerful work, doing healing around that, super powerful. I know I have done a lot of healing there, and I still have a lot more healing to do myself with my womb, and that's something that I'm embarking on at this point in time as well. And the more I tap into that, the more I feel powerful in a really fierce and gentle way at the same time. You know, like true power, inner knowing, connected to my intuition, connected to my conviction, having a stronger sense of myself, not being so swayed or not caring so much what other people say, think, or do. Like, this is me, you know, and being able to stand in that, be embodied in that. Yeah. So I think in general, it's my feeling that is a pandemic. You know, we've got a culture of women who have been shamed, basically, right? Or who are feeling shame and who are disconnected from the power of their womb, you know. So this is, I think, incredibly powerful work, which I really am only just, you know, stepping into myself over the last few years. So, and it's really rich, and I get really excited about diving deeper into it.
I know it's powerful work as well. Part of me just wants to cry because it's just, I'm so happy to have this conversation. The tears are coming because of that shame, because I see it. It's everywhere. I have a little shame as well. And I think it's accepting that and speaking it, communicating it, even just voicing, I hold shame, or I've been shamed, I'm feeling shamed for whatever reason. I love that you are nurturing and really honouring the womb. And a little image came into my mind when you were talking about a woman stepping into her power of one of my favourite songs of The Greatest Showman, with the woman who has the beard. I'm going to get emotional again. She steps, look out, because here we come. The marching of the beat of the drum. This is me, I just love that song, and I felt that image come through when you said, we need to be in our power. And I think this is why I, focus on women in midlife, because there's so many women of all ages, but I think, they feel so lost, and they have lost themselves, they've lost their power, and they've disassociated with themselves, right?
Absolutely. And I think, at that age as well, there's been decades of putting other people first, and there's been decades of surviving in a man's world. I still judge myself for saying these things, because years ago, I have to keep giving these caveats, because years ago, if I heard a woman saying this, I'd be like, oh, get over it. It's no big deal. It actually is a big deal, so it really has been this man's world, right? So we're in this real confused state, men and women, we've got women who are being more masculine, and men confused about what it is to be man, and trying to be more, new age and soft. And sure, maybe there was some of both of that needed on both sides, but we've just got so grey on all of that we've got everybody kind of trying to be the same and not being what the other needs. We need the warriors, and we need the priestesses and the goddesses, and the warriors on both sides, that feminine energy and that masculine energy. And when they're both healthy, we both thrive. So it's not just, poor women in this situation. The men are suffering too, because they're not in their power either, So it's up to each of us to be, reclaiming that, and I think when we look at menopausal symptoms as well, menopause isn't meant to be a disease or a medical condition, right? It's a natural cycle, a change of cycle, a change of phase in our life, so just like going through puberty is, and so when we have the right environment for that and the right support for that, it can be a really beautiful, smooth process. It's this time of coming into greater wisdom, greater intuition, you're becoming more of the sage. It's there's some real yummy, juicy feelings to all of that,
Ooh,
but
there is.
We're in this culture. That's right. But again, we're in this culture that has, certain judgments about aging in general, which is not helpful and is quite a modern thing. We used to really respect and revere our elders, and now they're in nursing homes with nobody visiting them, so there's a lot of elements to it, and that creates more trauma as it is. But I guess, what I was getting at there with menopause is that for all these different reasons, there's this hardening, the feminine's really soft and has flow. And the masculine is more solid and direction. We've got a lot of women, myself included, who, are really focused on the direction side of things and less about the flow. So that's been a big, challenge and lesson and experience of mine in my life, of embracing the gentleness and the softness and the fluidity more, and not worry so much about the direction all the time, And if we get to menopause and we're still in that, get stuff done, fix things, resolve other people's problems, hold on, stay tight because I'm not really feeling myself, well, that's when you're going to have the symptoms. Because your poor adrenal glands are kind of shot, basically. So they also go into producing your stress hormones as a priority over producing progesterone, for example. So, our adrenal glands take over sex hormone production after menopause, but in terms of survival, your stress hormones are more important than your sex hormones. So if you're stressed, you're going to be producing stress hormones, same ingredients, but it's going to make stress hormones. And then you're going to get more menopausal symptoms like hot flushes and dry vagina and mood changes and all of that kind of stuff because you're stressed. Mm-hmm. Well, there's too much heat in your liver and you're angry, but you haven't expressed it. Those kinds of things.
Thank you. It's all connected. We cannot separate anything. Thank you so much for all of that. It's just, so fascinating, and I am very comfortable sitting here on the couch chatting to you, but I'm mindful of your time. With my guests, I usually ask them what they feel a rejuvenated woman is, but I feel that you've already encapsulated that, because you said, she's in her power and she's balanced that feminine and masculine energy, and, she's sure of herself. Would that be right, or would you like to add?
Yeah, and I would also say she's practicing all those things, because it takes time and healing to get there as well. But so long as you are on that path, like, that's the main thing. It's not about being this perfect, amazing, I've got my balance of masculine and feminine in place and I'm all sorted. Like, it's, it's this total flux all the time, and this dance, it's forever changing. It's not something that stays the same either. So I guess I would say maybe more that it is lovingly accepting all parts of yourself, even the ones that you typically wouldn't perceive as being lovable. Yeah.
That's beautiful, and that meets it with a lot of love and compassion from the heart.
Absolutely, from the heart.
Which you're so all about. That's why I love you so much. And I'm sure our listeners, going to go, if they don't know Helen Padarin already, they will certainly be following you. So, darling, where can our listeners find you? I will put all of the links in our show notes and all of those references that you mentioned in our conversation today. Where can they find you to either work with you? Can they see you for trauma therapy?
Yeah, so helenpadarin.com is my website. There's wellembodied.com.au as well, which is the clinic, but you get taken there via Helen Padarin. And on mainly Instagram and Telegram at Helen Padarin, Facebook as well, but I just don't get on there very often. So, but also at Helen Padarin. So all of the places. Well, not all of them, but enough.
Yeah, she's not hard. She's not too hard to find. And I think I would love to bring you in person here on the couch. And I think, maybe we can have a chat of doing some, circles and healing things for the ladies on the coast, or they can jump in online as well, of how we can really heal that collective of the feminine energy. Yeah.
Well, create that bubble that can exude out for ourselves and others.
Yeah, I think that is definitely needed at this point. Dana, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I can't wait to see you in person. I know that's going to happen real soon. I appreciate you and all the work that you are doing for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. It's an honour to be here, and I love and appreciate all that you are.
Thank you for tuning in to today's podcast episode with the beautiful Helen Padarin on trauma. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email and we'll get back to you with some references or some answers. Most definitely. Have an awesome week.